They said it was a test of my independence, that they were only trying to help me grow stronger. But all I remember is the cold wind hitting my face as they drove away without looking back, leaving me standing alone in the parking lot of that grocery store, clutching the keys to the very car they had just taken from me. I was 81 years old, and in that moment I felt smaller than I ever had before, as if I had shrunk to nothingness, invisible to the people who were supposed to love me most. I sat on the cracked pavement with no purse, no phone, no wallet, only those keys, heavy and cold in my palm, a cruel reminder of their absence and my sudden solitude. My name is Evelyn, and I live now in a small, modest apartment above a bakery where the smell of fresh bread and cinnamon drifts through the thin walls. But that day in the parking lot marked the end of a chapter and the beginning of a life I never expected to have to choose for myself. For years, I had been slipping quietly into the background of my own family's life, a shadow trailing behind the noise and activity of my daughter's house, where I was once the matriarch, the keeper of traditions, the woman whose voice carried the stories of our ancestors. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, my opinions stopped being asked for. My presence no longer needed beyond the occasional nod or polite smile. They told me it was for my own good, that I needed to learn to do things on my own, to be less dependent, to show strength in ways they thought I could no longer find within myself. I tried to believe them, tried to accept their help wrapped in excuses. But the truth was that each small dismissal, each casual oversight, chipped away at my sense of belonging until there was almost nothing left. That morning, my daughter Susan and her husband Mark told me they were taking me to the grocery store so I could practice being independent and gain confidence. But instead, they parked the car, handed me the keys, and said, "We're going to circle the block, give you some space to figure it out." Their smiles were tight, their eyes avoiding mine, and I knew then that this wasn't really about helping me. It was a test, a cruel experiment masked as care, and I was the subject. I remember the exact moment they pulled away, the way the car's taillights flickered as they turned onto the main street, leaving me frozen in the middle of the parking lot, surrounded by strangers who didn't even glance in my direction. I tried to make sense of it, tried to remind myself that they loved me, that this was for my own good. But the sting of betrayal was sharp and immediate, settling deep in my bones like a winter chill that no amount of layered sweaters could chase away. I sat down on the cold asphalt, the rough texture pressing into my skirt, and looked around for someone, anyone, to ask for help. A mother and child walked by, chatting and laughing, oblivious to the old woman with no purse and only a set of car keys sitting like forgotten luggage at their feet. No one stopped. No one asked if I needed a ride, if I was lost or hurt. I was just there, an afterthought in a place where people come and go, with lives that don't have time to notice the ones left behind. For what felt like hours, I stayed there, silent except for the occasional click of a car doors and the distant hum of engines. The sky turned from bright morning blue to a dull gray as clouds gathered, and a light drizzle began, soft but persistent, dampening my hair and clothes. I had nothing to cover me, no umbrella, no shelter, just the cold reality of being abandoned under the pretense of helping me grow. I thought about calling my daughter, pleading for them to come back, but I had no phone, no way to reach out, only those keys that seemed suddenly meaningless without a car to open. The embarrassment was crushing, but more than that, it was the sense that I had been erased from their plans, their hearts, and even from the very life I had worked so hard to build. In that moment, I was not a mother or grandmother or a woman with a history. I was simply forgotten. Eventually, a kind stranger approached, a man who noticed my confusion and discomfort and offered a gentle hand and a few kind words. He took me to a nearby bench and sat with me, listening as I explained in halting, measured words what had happened. He didn't judge or rush me. He just nodded, understanding that sometimes the hardest battles are fought in silence, in waiting, in simply being left behind by those who once promised to care. That day, as I sat in that parking lot with the rain soaking through my coat, I realized something profound. This abandonment was not the end, but a beginning. It was a cruel wake-up call that forced me to see clearly what I had been denying, the truth that sometimes the people we love most are the ones who hurt us the deepest, not out of malice, but out of their own fears, limitations, and misunderstandings. And so, with that heavy understanding weighing on my chest, I stood up, brushed the damp hair from my face, and decided that if they were going to leave me behind, then I would find my own way forward. That night, I sat in the dim light of my small apartment, the scent of freshly baked bread drifting through the open window, and I thought about all the years I had given to my family, the meals prepared, the celebrations organized, the endless support offered without expectation of return. I remembered the warmth of my late husband's hands, the laughter of my grandchildren echoing through our home, and the quiet moments when I allowed myself to hope that love would always be enough to hold us together. But love, I learned, is not always enough. Sometimes it must be fought for. Sometimes it must be taken back from those who would diminish it. And sometimes it means standing alone in the cold, with only the keys to a car and a heart full of memories that no one can take away. I am Evelyn, and this is where my story truly begins. Not with the betrayal, but with the quiet strength that followed, the slow reclaiming of a life that was once shared, but is now solely mine. The moment I realized what had truly happened was not. The moment they drove off, but later that afternoon when I finally found a way to reach someone who could tell me the truth without sugarcoating it. For hours I had sat in that parking lot, rain seeping through my thin coat and chilling me to the bone, holding the cold, heavy keys as if they might still unlock not just the car, but the door to the life I thought I had. I had hoped, foolishly I suppose, that my daughter or her husband would circle back, that they would suddenly remember the old woman standing alone, and that they would call out, apologize, or at least stop and offer a ride home. But no one came. The silence they left behind was deafening. Eventually, I mustered enough courage to walk the few blocks to the closed gas station, where a faded payphone still hung like a relic from a forgotten era. My hands trembled as I dialed the number of Mr. Harris, my old neighbor from decades ago, a man who had once been my friend and confidant when my own family seemed to drift further away. His voice on the other end was startled, then softened when I explained my predicament. "Evelyn," he said gently, "you don't deserve this. I'll come get you." His words were a balm to a wound that had only just begun to fester. When he arrived in his aging pickup truck, he looked at me with eyes that held years of knowing, the kind of eyes that understood what it meant to be left behind by the people you love. I climbed in, feeling the worn leather seat beneath me, the smell of engine oil and pine air freshener filling the cab. We drove slowly back toward the neighborhood I had once called home, but I no longer belonged. Every street corner, every familiar tree felt distant and foreign, as if I were a ghost walking through the remnants of a life that was no longer mine to claim. Once inside his modest house, warmed by the soft glow of a single lamp and the faint crackle of a radio playing an old jazz tune, I told him everything. The parking lot, the cold dismissal, the hollow excuse of a test of independence they had used to justify their cruelty. He listened without interruption, nodding slowly, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a set of keys. "You still have the title for the car, don't you?" he asked. I nodded, the small piece of paper folded carefully in my purse. "Good," he said. "We'll make sure you get what's rightfully yours." In that moment, a small seed of determination took root inside me, fragile but insistent. They might have left me stranded, stripped me of comfort and dignity, but they had not taken everything. That car was still mine, at least on paper, and if they wanted to treat me like a child to be tested and controlled, then I would show them that I was capable of reclaiming what was mine. The idea of selling the car, of severing one more tie that bound me to their twisted sense of care, felt both terrifying and exhilarating. It was the first act of defiance I had allowed myself in years. The days that followed were filled with quiet preparation. I contacted the Department of Motor Vehicles, navigating the labyrinth of phone menus and indifferent clerks with patients I didn't know I had left. At first, I encountered resistance, questions about my mental capacity, suggestions that perhaps a family member should be involved. But when I calmly explained that the car was registered in my name and that I was of sound mind, the bureaucratic walls began to crumble. A clerk finally confirmed that despite their attempts to control and overshadow me, the registration and insurance were still under my name. That small victory was a beacon of hope, proof that the system still recognized me as an individual, not just a dependent to be shuffled aside. Meanwhile, my daughter's calls became less frequent but more insistent, filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "Mom, you don't understand what you're doing," she said one afternoon, her voice sharp and strained. "This isn't just about a car. It's about family. You're making things harder for all of us." I listened silently, the words washing over me like cold water, but I refused to engage. I had spent too many years bending to their will, shrinking myself to fit the mold they had crafted. Now it was my turn to stand firm. When the buyer finally appeared, a woman in her early 40s, pragmatic and straightforward, she looked me in the eye and said, "If someone had left me in a parking lot with nothing but the keys to their car, I'd sell the whole house too." Her bluntness was oddly comforting. The transaction was quiet, efficient. I signed the papers with a steady hand, the weight of each signature lifting something heavy from my chest. The cash in my hand was more than just money. It was a symbol of freedom, a tangible proof that I still had control over my life. That same day, my daughter arrived at my door, fury burning in her eyes. She demanded explanations, reasons, promises that I would reconsider, but I said nothing. I simply closed the door with a firm click that echoed louder than any argument. "You left me once," I thought silently, "so now I'm doing the same." The lock turned, final and resolute. In that moment, I felt a clarity I had not known in years. The understanding that reclaiming my life meant saying no to their rules, no to their tests, and yes to myself. Later that evening, as I sat in my small apartment, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long shadows on the walls, I poured myself a cup of tea and savored the quiet taste of a life reawakened. I thought of the car keys, now gone, and of the doors they had closed behind me. But more than that, I thought of the doors I was beginning to open, doors to a future I would choose on my own terms. The betrayal was deep and painful, but it was also the catalyst for a transformation I had been too afraid to begin. Now, with the echoes of that cruel test fading into the past, I was ready to step forward, uncertain but unbroken, into the life that was still mine to claim. After the shock of that afternoon had settled into a dull ache, I began to notice the quieter, more insidious ways my life was being eroded, like sand slipping steadily through fingers I no longer trusted to hold on. The abandonment in the parking lot was the brutal, undeniable moment, but before that day came a long trail of small, almost invisible acts that slowly, persistently chipped away at who I was and what I believed I deserved. It was not sudden, it was not explosive. It was a quiet diminishing that unfolded over months, sometimes years, until I was standing there with the cold car keys in my hand, realizing that I had been erased by 1,000 little cuts, each one disguised as care, as kindness, as what was supposedly best for me. In the beginning, it was the little things that caught me off guard. I remember the morning I woke up to find that my mail was no longer coming to my own address, but was instead being forwarded to my daughter's house without my consent. At first, I thought it must have been a mistake, a bureaucratic mix-up. But when I called the post office, the clerk told me it had been requested by a family member for my convenience. That word, convenience, felt like a slap. It was as if they had decided I was no longer capable of handling my own affairs, that my voice was no longer necessary in the decisions about my own life. I accepted it at first, convincing myself that it was easier this way, that I didn't want to be a burden. But inside, I felt my autonomy slipping away like water through a cracked cup. Then came the doctor's appointments. Without consulting me, my daughter switched my primary care physician to someone closer to her home, someone she assured me was better equipped to manage my health. I was not asked for my opinion. I was informed. The new doctor's office was a place I had never been before, staffed by faces that did not know me or the stories etched into my skin. At appointments, I found myself lost in a system that felt more like a conveyor belt than a source of care. My questions were brushed aside as worries of an anxious elderly patient, and the prescriptions I received seemed more about convenience than necessity. I remember the cold look from the nurse when I insisted on a second opinion for a medication change. The message was clear: speak less, comply more. At home, the pattern continued. My daughter began to manage my days with schedules and reminders, which at first seemed helpful. She called it gentle transitions, and easing into what she said would be a safer, simpler life for me. But the gentle transitions were anything but. One morning, I discovered that my bank cards had been misplaced, a phrase used casually, almost humorously, by my son-in-law when I asked why my card no longer worked. I was told to use a new card issued in my name, but controlled through a joint account with them. The freedom to spend or save disappeared overnight. When I tried to ask why this had been done without my knowledge, I was met with a sigh and the words, "We're just trying to protect you, Mom." You wouldn't want to get scammed, would you? I nodded because arguing seemed futile, but inside I burned with the knowledge that the trust I had built over a lifetime was being undermined by those I loved. Even the smallest moments became moments of erasure. Invitations to family gatherings stopped arriving. I would hear about celebrations only after they had passed, as if I had been a ghost wandering through an empty house. The phone calls became fewer, the visits rarer, and when I did see them, I was often reminded of my place. There were glances that lingered too long on my clothes, as if to say I no longer belonged in their curated world. The once familiar kitchen where I had prepared meals for decades was replaced by a sterile space where my presence felt awkward and misplaced. It was as if I was no longer a person to be included, but a problem to be managed, a responsibility to be minimized. I remember one afternoon when I tried to help in the garden. I had always loved tending to the roses, the lavender bushes, and the small herb patch that grew behind the house. But when I reached for a pair of pruning shears, my daughter's hand stopped mine firmly but gently. "Let me do it," she said softly, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of pity and control. "You should rest." I forced a smile, but the sting was there. My hands, which had nurtured life for so many years, were being told they were too fragile to touch the earth. It was not just a matter of physical limitation, but an invisible decree that I was no longer trusted to do the things that had once defined me. These were not moments of drama or confrontation. There were no raised voices or angry tears. There was only a steady, unrelenting slide toward invisibility, as if I were fading away, not with a bang, but with a sigh. I found myself shrinking into silence, retreating from the people who had once been my world, because I no longer recognized the roles they assigned me. The parking lot test was the culmination, the loudest note in a symphony of neglect and control that had been playing for too long. When they left me there, without a phone, without a plan, I understood that they were not helping me learn to be independent. They were teaching me to be invisible. But even as the weight of that quiet erasure pressed down on me, a small flame of resistance flickered inside. I realized that I did not want to disappear, not completely, not without a fight. The erosion of my dignity was painful, but it also became a catalyst for a reckoning. I began to notice the moments when I could still make choices, no matter how small, deciding what to eat, what to wear, how to spend a few quiet hours. I found myself writing notes, keeping receipts, holding on to things that reminded me I still existed beyond their shadows. One evening, after a long day of feeling like a guest in my own life, I stood in front of the mirror and looked deeply into my own eyes. I saw the woman I had been, the mother, the grandmother, the wife, the friend, and I knew that while they might try to rewrite my story, I still held the pen. The parking lot, the lost mail, the changed doctors, the misplaced bank cards, they were attempts to shrink me, but I was larger than their fears and limitations. I was still here. That night, I took the small, leather-bound journal I had kept since my youth and began to write. Not for anyone else, but for myself. I wrote about the erosion, the small betrayals disguised as care, and the storm of emotions that raged quietly beneath my calm exterior. I wrote about the longing to be seen and the determination to be heard. Each word was a thread, stitching together the frayed edges of my identity. In the stillness of that night, I made a promise. I would not let the quiet cruelty of those I loved define my final chapters. I would find my way back to myself, no matter the cost. The first escalation was subtle, almost invisible to the world around me, but it was a battle fought in silence, a struggle to hold on to dignity in the face of erasure. The parking lot was just the brutal punctuation mark at the end of a long sentence. What followed was the slow gathering of strength, the quiet reclaiming of a life that had been slipping away. And in that reclaiming, I began to see that while they could try to leave me behind, I was not finished. Not yet. The moment I reached out to that old neighbor and found his willing hand was the first flicker of light in what had been a long, dark tunnel. It was not a sudden transformation, nor a grand declaration of independence, but a quiet turning inward and then outward again, a slow awakening to the truth that I could still act, that I could still claim small pieces of my life back. When he drove me away from that parking lot, away from the cold pavement and the empty spaces where my family had left me to find myself, I felt something shift deep inside, something that had been dormant for too long. I realized that I did not have to wait for their permission to live, to move, to breathe. In the days that followed, with his gentle encouragement and steady presence, I began to plan. The car, the one they had left me with as if it were a token or a test, was still mine, legally and in my heart. That fact became a lifeline, a symbol of the control I was determined to reclaim. We sat together at his kitchen table, the light from a single lamp casting long shadows over old photographs and worn books, and I carefully explained what I wanted to do. Sell the car, turn it into something tangible, something real that could fund a new start. It was not about the money, really. It was about saying no to the narrative they had written for me, about refusing to be a passive player in a story that did not honor my voice. As I navigated the bureaucracy, the DMV, the insurance companies, the legal forms, I found an unexpected strength in the act of reclaiming my name and my rights. Each phone call, each visit to an office was a small victory against the erasure I had endured. The clerks and officials, strangers to my family drama, treated me with a respect that was foreign but deeply healing. I was not just the elderly mother or the inconvenient relative anymore. I was Evelyn, a woman capable of making decisions, of asserting her autonomy. The confirmation that the car was still registered in my name was more than a bureaucratic detail. It was proof that I had not been erased entirely. During this time, I also began to rebuild my daily rhythm, a rhythm that had been disrupted by years of quiet neglect. With the support of my neighbor and the determination that had quietly kindled inside me, I found a small apartment, modest and warm, with creaky floors and a window that let in the morning sun. It was a place of my own, not borrowed or granted, but chosen. Here, I began to stitch together the threads of a life that was no longer defined by their expectations or their control. I found solace in small routines, brewing tea just the way I liked it, reading books that spoke to me, listening to music that stirred forgotten memories. The sale of the car itself was both a practical and symbolic act. When the buyer, a straightforward woman who seemed to understand the gravity behind the transaction, handed me the cash, I felt a surge of empowerment I had not known for years. It was as if the keys I relinquished were not just to a vehicle, but to a past that had constrained me. The money was modest, but it carried the weight of freedom. With it, I paid rent for my new place, bought a warm coat for the coming winter, and treated myself to small pleasures I had long denied. A fresh loaf of bread from the bakery downstairs, a crossword book to keep my mind sharp, a candle that filled the room with soft light. But perhaps the most important shift was internal, a change in how I saw myself and what I believed I deserved. The silence that had once been suffocating became a space for reflection and healing. I allowed myself to feel the pain without letting it consume me, to acknowledge the loneliness without surrendering to despair. In that quiet, I found a flicker of hope, a sense that the life I was beginning to build was real and valuable, even if it was not the one I had imagined or hoped for. I was no longer the woman they had left behind. I was a woman who had chosen to rise. This turning point was not without its challenges. Old fears surfaced. Moments of doubt crept in during the quiet hours of the night. I wondered if I was making a mistake, if the fractures in my family could ever be healed, if I would ever be truly seen again. But I also knew that staying where I was, waiting for their acceptance or permission, had become a prison. The shift was messy and uneven, filled with hesitation and courage in equal measure. Yet every small act of self-care, every phone call returned, every letter written but not sent, was a step away from silence and toward voice. In this new rhythm, I began to meet others who, like me, were navigating the later chapters of their lives with grace and grit. A kind woman at the bakery who shared stories of loss and renewal, an elderly man at the park who taught me about resilience through the metaphor of birds returning each spring. These connections, fragile and tentative at first, became a lifeline, reminding me that I was not alone. The community I found was different from the family I had known, but no less meaningful. Looking back, I see the midpoint as a moment of quiet rebellion, a refusal to be defined by the actions of others, and a decision to reclaim my narrative, one small choice at a time. It was not about forgetting the past or erasing the pain, but about honoring my own needs and desires, about finding strength in vulnerability and hope in new beginnings. This shift was the heart of my journey, the moment when I stepped from the shadows into a light that was entirely my own. The days following my departure from the life I once knew were a delicate balance between liberation and confrontation, between the fragile hope of a new beginning and the heavy weight of a past that refused to stay buried. The quiet of my new world was often interrupted by echoes from the family I had left behind, letters, phone calls, and eventually unexpected visits that forced me to face the tangled web of emotions and unresolved histories I had carried with me for so long. This was the second escalation, the moment when the past came knocking again, not with the gentle persuasion of concern, but with the heavy hand of pressure and expectation that threatened to unravel the fragile peace I was building. It began with a letter from my grandson, Kieran, the one person who had remained a constant thread through the fabric of my fading family ties. His handwriting was familiar, yet tentative, as if he were stepping carefully across a fragile ice. The letter was brief but sincere, a small beacon of warmth in the growing storm. He wrote about his worries, about the silence that had stretched between us like a canyon too wide to cross. He asked where I was, if I was safe, if I was okay. His words carried no judgment, no demand for explanations, just a simple longing for connection. Holding that letter, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't allowed myself in a long time: hope. But hope is a fragile thing, easily shattered by the harsh realities that followed. Soon after, there was the unexpected arrival of Lisa, my daughter-in-law, standing stiffly in the corner of the cafe where I now worked mornings. Her presence was a jarring contrast to the quiet rhythms I had begun to cherish, the soft clinking of cups, the gentle murmur of conversations, the familiar aroma of coffee and toast. Lisa's face was a mask of controlled emotion, a blend of frustration, guilt, and something I couldn't quite place, perhaps regret or calculation. She came not as a daughter-in-law seeking reconciliation, but as an emissary of the family's demands and anxieties. She spoke carefully, her voice low and measured, trying to bridge the distance with words that felt rehearsed. "Martha," she said, using my given name in a way that felt formal and distant. "We didn't know what else to do. It was a panic. We thought you were behind us. The kids were upset. We were worried." Her eyes searched mine, looking for a crack in the armor I had built around myself. But I had learned to hold my ground, to meet their attempts with calm resolve rather than anger or tears. I nodded slowly, the memory of that cold day in the parking lot flashing through my mind like a warning. 8 hours, I wanted to say. 8 hours alone, waiting. No calls, no check-ins, just abandonment disguised as concern. Lisa's visit was followed by a flurry of communications from my son, Adam, and legal representatives hired at his behest. Letters arrived at my small apartment, thick envelopes filled with carefully worded demands and veiled threats. They spoke of concern for my well-being, the family's desire to find a resolution, and the need for cooperation. But beneath the polished language lay an undercurrent of control, a reminder that my autonomy was still up for debate, that my refusal to play the role assigned to me was seen as rebellion rather than resistance. I read the letters with a mixture of weariness and quiet defiance, folding them carefully and placing them aside. They were no longer my story. The media intrusion was an unexpected twist, a local newspaper article featuring my disappearance and the family's public expressions of worry. A photograph of me from years ago smiling at a family gathering was plastered across the page, accompanied by quotes that painted me as vulnerable and confused. The portrayal was both inaccurate and infuriating, reducing me to a stereotype I had spent a lifetime fighting against. The community that had once known me now saw only a headline, a story of loss and mystery, yet the article also gave me something unexpected: proof. Proof that my absence had shaken the carefully constructed image of the family, and that my decision to walk away was no longer invisible. In the midst of this turmoil, I found solace in the quiet friendships I was forging. People like Arthur, the elderly man who came every morning to the cafe for his coffee, bringing with him stories of his late wife and the simple joys of watching. Birds in the park. His presence was a balm, a reminder that life could still be gentle, that connection could be found in shared moments rather than blood ties. And Joyce, my landlady, whose gruff exterior hid a warmth and understanding that welcomed me without questions or judgment. Together, they formed a small circle of support that contrasted sharply with the pressures from my family. The pressure from home escalated with the arrival of a lawyer, Derek Sorensen, who came to the cafe with a suit too stiff and a tone too careful. He spoke of concerns for my safety, suggestions of legal guardianship, and attempts to mediate the situation. But I met him with the same quiet strength I had summoned before. "Tell Adam and Lisa," I said firmly, "I am not a pet to be managed. There are no next steps unless I take them." His eyes flickered with something surprise, perhaps respect, but no matter. I turned and walked away, the sound of the door closing behind me like a seal on my resolve. Despite their attempts to control the narrative, I was no longer willing to be a passive player in their drama. When Lisa came again, this time to the cafe, she was softer, more vulnerable. She confessed to not wanting to replace me, but to wanting space, to having been overwhelmed by the shadow I cast over their lives. Her words were honest, stripped of pretense, and though they cut deeply, I met them with a quiet truth. I am not your shadow. I am my own person. She left without finishing her coffee, the weight of that moment hanging in the air like a promise of uneasy peace. Amid these confrontations, my bond with Kieran deepened. He was different, unburdened by the expectations and resentments that clouded his parents. Our conversations were filled with the gentle laughter of shared memories and the cautious hope of new beginnings. He did not demand my return. He simply wished me well, understood my need for space, and offered himself as a connection untethered from past conflicts. In his presence, I felt the possibility of healing that was not contingent on forgiveness, but on acceptance. Yet even as I navigated these shifting relationships, the pressure remained. The letters piled up, the phone messages grew in urgency, and the social scrutiny intensified. The public performance of concern by my family felt like a cage. Their worries, a way to keep me tethered to a role I had outgrown. But I was no longer willing to be defined by their fear or their need for control. I burned their letters one by one, a symbolic act of release and defiance, watched the flames consume their demands, and felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The second escalation was not just about confrontation, it was about clarity. The moment when I understood that the past could knock as loudly as it pleased, but the door would remain closed unless I chose otherwise. It was a test of my strength, my boundaries, and my commitment to myself. I was no longer the woman who waited for life to include her. I was the woman who chose when and how to be present. This phase was fraught with pain, yes, but also with a growing sense of agency. I was learning to speak my truth without fear of dismissal, to set limits without guilt, and to find joy in the small acts of everyday life that no one could take from me. The cafe became my sanctuary, a place where I was known not as a symbol of family conflict, but as a woman with skills, stories, and a voice. The friendships I cultivated there, the quiet moments of peace, and the letters I wrote but did not send, all became the threads of a new life I was weaving, one that belonged solely to me. Looking back, I see the second escalation as the crucible in which my resolve was forged. It was the storm that threatened to break me, but ultimately polished me, revealing the strength beneath the surface. It was the moment when I stopped hiding behind silence and stepped fully into the light of my own being, no longer waiting for permission, no longer tethered by others' fears. I was free, not because the past had forgotten me, but because I had remembered myself. The day I finally sent the letters, the ones that would close the last chapters of my old life, was a day heavy with both relief and finality. I had rehearsed the words in my mind for weeks, shaping them carefully to carry the weight of years of silence and endurance, yet free from bitterness or blame. It was not a moment of rage, but one of quiet strength, the kind that comes when you have looked deep into the abyss of loss and come back to stand firmly in your own truth. I sat at my small kitchen table, the light from the window soft and pale against the worn wood, and with a steady hand I wrote to Lisa first. The letter was brief, 3 lines only, but each one carried a lifetime of meaning. I told her that I knew what she had done and what she had not said, that I was not angry, but I was done waiting, that I would not be coming back. I wished her well and closed the door on what once was. Sending that letter was an act of release. It was the clearest signal I could give that I was no longer available to be their object of pity, their convenient caretaker, or their problem to solve. It was my way of reclaiming the dignity that had been stripped from me through years of quiet erasure and that cruel parking lot abandonment. The very next day, Lisa appeared at the cafe again, but this time her approach was different. No longer an emissary of control or anxiety, she was softer, worn down by the distance she had created and the truth she could no longer deny. Her eyes searched mine for a connection that words could not fully express, and I met her not with forgiveness, but with understanding. "I wasn't trying to replace you," she said quietly. The armor of her usual defenses melted away for a moment. "I just didn't want your shadow in every room." And I told her gently, "I am not your shadow. I am my own person, and I am learning to be one again." She left without finishing her coffee, leaving behind a silence filled with unsaid things, but also with possibility. That same week, I sent a final letter to the lawyer who had come to the cafe, the one who spoke for my family as if I were a child to be managed. My words were measured and firm. I was of sound mind, living in a safe environment and not under duress. I informed him that I had retained local legal counsel and that any further attempts to contact me under the guise of concern would be considered harassment. This letter was not just for the lawyer. It was a declaration to the world that I was no longer a passive figure in someone else's story. I was an agent of my own destiny. The sense of closure that followed was not immediate or loud. It came in quiet moments. The soft click of the mailbox door as the letters went out, the weight lifting from my chest as I folded the papers and sealed the envelopes. It was in the way I walked through the cafe the next morning, head held a little higher, apron tied more securely around my waist, ready to meet whatever came with calm resolve. Heather, who ran the cafe with quiet efficiency, handed me an extra shift without asking. Her simple words, "You're the only one who shows up early," feeling like an unexpected gift. Arthur came in just before noon that day, looking tired but steady, and remarked that I looked lighter. I told him about the letters, and he nodded knowingly, saying softly, "Sometimes it's the unsent letters that change everything, and sometimes it's the ones you send without waiting for a reply." That evening, I stood in the doorway of my small apartment, the smells of garlic and dried herbs mingling with the faint hum of the street outside. Franklin, the grumpy cat who had claimed me as his own, brushed against my legs with quiet insistence. Joyce was in the kitchen, humming softly as she stirred a pot of something fragrant. I was hungry, not just for food, but for the fullness of a life reclaimed. Joyce turned to me with a knowing smile and said, "Hope you're hungry." I was, and we ate in the comfortable silence that comes from shared understanding rather than forced conversation. The weeks that followed felt like the unfolding of a long-awaited spring after a harsh winter. Joyce's 70th birthday passed quietly, but with warmth, marked by a simple chocolate cake and a card that read, "You're not old. You're vintage." Her laughter filled the room, a sound I had come to cherish as a symbol of resilience and acceptance. We celebrated in the way only two women who had weathered storms together can, without pretense, with gentle teasing and the comfort of companionship. Life settled into a rhythm that was new but deeply satisfying. The cafe became not just a place of work, but a community, a space where I was valued for who I was now, not who I had been or who I was expected to be. The friendships I nurtured there, the quiet mornings spent preparing coffee and listening to the soft murmur of conversation, grounded me. Arthur's presence was a constant reassurance, his gentle humor and stories weaving into the fabric of my days. Joyce's house was a refuge, filled with the sounds and smells of real living, lavender, fried onions, the creak of floorboards that spoke of years and stories. One evening, as the wind stirred the leaves outside my window and the city settled into twilight, I sat down with pen and paper to write a letter, not to my family, but to myself. I wrote, "Dear me, you waited so long for someone to save you. You forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back. I sealed the letter and tucked it inside the drawer of my dresser, behind the old recipe cards, where I could find it whenever I needed to remember who I was and how far I had come. That night, as I lay in bed with the window cracked open to the cool night air, the sound of the wind was soft and steady, like a lullaby for a second chance. I was free, not because the past had forgotten me, but because I had remembered myself. The letters sent, the doors closed, the boundaries set. They were not the end, but the beginning of a life rebuilt with quiet dignity and fierce love for myself. I was no longer waiting for permission or validation. I was my own sign, my own noise in the silence, my own step away from the parking lot where they had left me. And as I drifted into sleep, I carried with me the knowledge that this story, my story, was not one of abandonment, but of release, not of loss, but of rediscovery. The life I had built was not what I expected, but it was mine, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed the storm of letters, visits, and confrontations, a calm settled over my new life that I hadn't known in years. The sharp edges of conflict softened into quiet acceptance, not because the past had been erased or forgiven, but because I had chosen to make peace with it on my own terms. I had rebuilt a world not of grand gestures or dramatic reconciliations, but of small, steady moments that stitched together the fabric of a life reclaimed. It was in the simple rituals, the morning walks through neighborhoods I was just beginning to know, the slow brewing of tea in a chipped mug, the crossword puzzles that teased my mind and made me smile. These were the things that anchored me, that reminded me I was more than the sum of betrayals and silences. One afternoon, a letter arrived, not from my daughter or son, but from Kieran, my grandson, the one thread of warmth that had never fully frayed. His handwriting was bolder now, less hesitant, as if he had found his voice alongside mine. Inside was an invitation, a simple, heartfelt request to visit, to talk, without pretense or expectation. He promised no drama, no demands, just the chance to be together in a space of mutual respect and care. Holding that letter, I felt a softness bloom in my chest, a fragile hope that some wounds could heal, not through forgetting, but through honest connection. The day I met Kieran again was neither grand nor fraught. It was quiet, held in the modest room of a small motel where he was staying. The air smelled faintly of takeout and hotel soap, familiar and strange at once. We sat side by side on the bed, careful to give each other space, speaking in soft tones about the past and the future, about books and jobs, and the small things that make life bearable. He told me I was the only person who ever made him feel enough just by sitting beside him, and I told him he had always been enough. There were no tears, no dramatic apologies, only the steady exchange of presence that spoke louder than words. When it was time to leave, we did not say goodbye. We simply held on a little longer, each reluctant to break the fragile thread we were weaving anew. Returning to my small apartment felt like coming home in a way I hadn't felt before. The creak of the floorboards, the gentle purring of Franklin the cat, the worn kitchen table where I had poured countless cups of coffee. All of it was mine, unclaimed and unthreatened. Joyce was there, waiting with a pot of something fragrant simmering on the stove, her presence a steady anchor in the shifting tides of my life. We ate together in companionable silence, the kind of quiet that speaks of understanding without the need for constant conversation. In the days that followed, I found joy in the ordinary, baking a sweet potato cake with an old recipe card written in my late husband's handwriting, watching Joyce dance in thick socks around the kitchen, feeling the soft weight of Franklin curled in my lap. I attended community potlucks where no one asked who I was or what I had done. I was simply another woman sharing food and laughter, my place earned by my presence alone. These small acts of belonging, free from the burdens of obligation or history, were a balm to a soul long wearied by invisibility. Sometimes I thought about the family I had left behind, the letters unopened, the calls unanswered. I did not feel anger anymore. There was only a deep, steady resolve not to be pulled back into old patterns of pain and dependence. I understood now that I had not been abandoned but released, that they had let go, because they could not hold on to a woman who was no longer willing to be invisible. And I, in turn, had let go of the ties that bound me to a role that had never truly fit. One evening, as the wind stirred the leaves outside and the city lights flickered through my window, I sat down with a pen and a blank card. I wrote to myself a letter, a reminder, a blessing, a promise. "Dear me," I began, "you waited so long for someone to save you that you forgot you were always the one holding the key. You didn't lose them. They let go. And you finally let go back. Look at the life that opened. Well done." I tucked the card inside my dresser drawer behind the recipe cards, where I could find it whenever I needed to remember my strength. Life was not perfect, nor was it easy, but it was real and mine. The coat I bought with the money from the car sale hung by the door, warm and waiting for cold mornings. The small radio on the windowsill played songs that reminded me of a youth long past but never forgotten. I walked with a steadier step, spoke with a softer voice, and smiled more freely. The woman who had once been left alone in a parking lot had grown into a woman who chose her own path, who found peace not in the approval of others, but in the quiet dignity of self-acceptance. And so, this is where my story ends. Not with a triumphant return or a dramatic reconciliation, but with a gentle, steady turning toward a future I build every day. If this story finds you at the right moment, if you hear the quiet in these words, know this: it is never too late to choose yourself, to step away from the shadows, to be your own sign in the silence. And when you do, come back and tell me. I will be here, waiting with a cup of tea and a chair warm just for you.